Good day, race fans. I'm Unsilent, and we're on the air with the Formula One Drive-Thru Podcast. Coming to you just hours after the conclusion of Round 6 of the Formula One season, the Monaco Grand Prix, the crown jewel of the Formula One season. And it has been won by Sebastian Vettel, winning the first Monaco Grand Prix for Ferrari since 2001, and Michael Schumacher. That familiar combination of the German national anthem followed by the Italian national anthem that we're starting to get used to this season, played once again after another Vettel win. He is third of the season after opening with Australia and then picking up another win in Bahrain. So let's go to the topics for today's podcast before we get too far into things. As always, the topics on the screen can be found in the description down below with timestamps. So if you want to skip to a particular thing, you can. We are going to start with our recap of the Monaco Grand Prix. Then we'll move on to the 2018 calendar, more news about the 2018 schedule. Then we're going to do a quick update on the 2018 driver market, more about mostly Verstappen. Then we're going to talk about the 2017 driver market. Oh, you didn't think everybody was kind of stuck where they were for now, because a little news about Jolyon Palmer rumor that's been cropping up in the Dutch press. And then Pirelli is going to be working on their 2018 tires after talking with the drivers after Spain. But first, let's start with a recap of the Monaco Grand Prix. Here are the results on your screen right now. Sebastian Vettel picks up the win, his third of the season, as I mentioned. Behind him, teammate Kimi Räikkönen, the Iceman, started on pole, finished in second. Well, he had a good run, but traffic, and we will talk about that in a moment. Daniel Ricciardo in third, probably maximizing the potential for his Red Bull this season until we get to, say, Hungary. Valtteri Bottas in fourth, Max Verstappen fifth. Then rounding out the top 10, you had Carlos Sainz, started sixth, finished sixth. Lewis Hamilton in seventh. We'll talk about Lewis's race really fast. Started in 13th. Racing is just as much luck as it is skill. And I would say Lewis going up 6 positions from his starting spot is equally luck and skill, because he had Magnussen, who had a tire problem, had to make 2 stops. Perez damaged his front wing, had to make an extra stop that pulled him out of sequence and ruined his race. And you had Hülkenberg, who lost his gearbox, and that was 3 cars that were ahead of Hamilton at the start of the race that got out of his way through luck, and then Hamilton, through strategy and through pace, was able to make up the remaining 3 spots and get himself to 7th. Romain Grosjean in 8th in car number 8, picks up 4 points for Haas. Felipe Massa started 14th. His teammate started in 17th, then his teammate DNF'd. Massa, that the Williams were struggling all weekend. They're good in a straight line. They're not so good in high downforce settings, so hey, any points for Williams, bonus for them really. And Kevin Magnussen rounding out the points in position number 10, just ahead of Jolyon Palmer, who we'll be talking about in a little bit. Let's start at, well, the start. Kimi Räikkönen led from pole. The only noteworthy guy that got away with a better, an improvement off the start was Lewis Hamilton, who jumped Stoffel Van Dorn 1 spot at the start. Stoffel, who made Q3, both McLarens actually made Q3 this week, but Button had 15th-place grid penalty, so he started from the pit lane, and Van Dorn had his own changes that required a 3-place grid penalty and dropped him down to, 12th after Button's penalties were applied. And you don't want to say it got processional fast, but it got processional fast. Until the pit stops, it's Monaco. You know what the score is around Monaco. It seemed to be a little worse for following people than usual, just because of how much downforce the cars have now compared to last season, so it was a lot harder for them to follow. So you saw guys string out to just beyond DRS range, with the exception of Perez, who pitted on lap 17. He needed a new nose. We didn't see what the hell happened to him. We assume that he hit the wall somewhere or he hit someone. But he was able to hold on to the back of Stroll, for example, and pass Stroll. Not that we saw any of that on TV. Thank you much, FOM race director. But we saw Perez was about the only one. If you had a significant speed advantage over someone, you could follow them. But if you were, kind of close on performance, you couldn't follow them close. But that's sort of, 1, the nature of Monaco, 2, the nature of these cars. It wasn't until about lap 33 that we saw cars coming into pit. Verstappen was the first to blink, going from ultras to super softs. He tried the undercut on Bottas, and it almost worked, except for the fact that Verstappen had a slightly slower pit stop. I think the Sky Sports guy said something in the range of like 0.7 of a second slower than Bottas. And if they had the same pit stop time, Max would have been able to get out just ahead of Bottas, probably. But as it was, the pit stop just kind of hampered Verstappen enough that he couldn't get by Bottas, as you can see in the final results. One lap after Bottas came in, Raikkonen came in, and he made his stop onto the super softs. And he came out right into traffic, right behind Button and right behind one of the Saubers, I believe, a Wehrlein. And so, overcut. On lap 39, Ricciardo comes in, and he overcuts his way past Bottas and Verstappen into functional P3. And then one lap later, it was Vettel who came in, and he got in for his stop, came out just ahead of Raikkonen, as you can see on the screen there. And that was good to put Vettel into the lead, and his race was pretty much done until lap 61. Wehrlein, as you can see on the screen here, that doesn't look right. Wehrlein's car is on its side at Portier, that's just at the entrance into the tunnel. He was fine. It looked pretty scary. What happened was, as he let one of the leaders by, Jenson Button took a look up inside of Wehrlein into Portier. A little ambitious, hit him in the left front to right rear contact, tipping Wehrlein up onto his side and putting him roll hoop first into the Tech Pro barrier there on the outside of Portier. Wehrlein was fine. His engineer asked him if he's okay, and he said, yeah, I'm okay, but I'd feel better if I could get out of the car. Sauber's day just got worse from there, because under the safety car, when the lapped cars could overtake to unlap themselves, Ericsson crashed at Saint-Devote going by a safety car. That was a bit embarrassing. That was the only action at Saint-Devote. Van Dorn quickly ended up in the wall at Saint-Devote when Perez tried to go underneath him on the restart. You know, it's what I'm not going to argue one way or the other that I don't think it was a dirty move. I think it was a little on the ambitious side, but I also think Van Dorn could have done more to avoid running into the wall. But it looked like he had gotten caught out on the marbles. When you get out on the marbles, you lose all the grip. It's like being on ice. It's kind of like slicks on a wet track, basically. Perez wasn't done because on lap 74, he crashed into the side of Kvyat at Raskas. Kvyat had to stop because of the damage. Perez had to stop, and that put him out of the points. Perez was complaining to his team that, like, you guys were making me change stuff on the car, so I couldn't concentrate and crashed into the side of them. It just looked like a bit ambitious move. Aside from Perez making it exciting, nothing was happening up front. It was Vettel all the way home after the pit stops, coming home for his third win of the season, as I mentioned, the second time he's won with the overcut, because he also pulled off the overcut to get past Hamilton in Australia as well, if you will recall. And with that win, let's go on to the driver's standings, and with that win, that gives Vettel a 25-point lead over Hamilton in the World Driver's Standings, 129 to 104. And it's Bottas, Raikkonen, and Ricciardo holding on to position number 5. And then Perez apparently had a 15-race point scoring streak going into this, and he had it ended. A little bit of his own doing. He must have hit something for the first pit stop, and he definitely hit something to necessitate his second pit stop, but he did get fastest lap of the race. Sainz with 6 jumps up to 8th in the World Driver Standings, and then you have Massa and Ocon. Ocon not scoring points for his first time driving for Force India. I think that might be worth mentioning as well. All right, on to the news. 2018 calendar news, courtesy of Joe Sayward, who is an independent F1 journalist. Over the last few weeks, people have been talking about the fate of the Interlagos circuit. The city of Sao Paulo is looking to offload the circuit and the costs associated with hosting that Grand Prix. Brazilian governments have been under fire in recent years for spending billions on the World Cup and the Olympics. Now that TV station Globo has pulled out of sponsoring the Brazilian Grand Prix, and the race promoter is moving back to Europe, everything in place to run and fund the race is sort of fall apart. So, Brazilian Grand Prix might be on its last legs. Bernie has talked about buying the track and therefore taking over promoting it. There is a possibility that Brazil may not be on the calendar next season. So we could be down to 20 races. Liberty Media has said that they will have 21 races on the calendar in 2018. One race that may be back on the calendar, Liberty Media has either signed and not announced, or all but signed a deal to continue the Singapore Grand Prix. I believe I've called that a modern signature event for Formula One to go alongside Monaco. So, yeah, I don't have any problem with them doing what they need to keep Singapore on the calendar. Liberty is also looking to make the German Grand Prix a permanent fixture on the calendar, as you know, it's currently alternating 1 year on, 1 year off, because Hockenheim and Nurburgring have, or had, an agreement to share the race 1 year on, 1 year off. And this is not a German Grand Prix year, because this is not a Hockenheim year. The problem is that there are no other viable candidates to replace the Nürburgring, and there are a number of issues, bad location, no infrastructure or track layout that isn't really conducive to Formula One. So it's not like, they could go to Lausitz or Oschersleben, but, they just aren't up to F1 standard for one reason or another. One story when it comes to the calendar to look forward to, and we won't have to worry about this for another month or two, but just to keep in mind, the British Grand Prix future is a little up in the air because the British Racing Drivers Club, the BRDC, who own Silverstone and promote the race, are likely to exercise a break clause in their contract with Formula One management to renegotiate their contract for better fees. And I say likely to, it's not a certainty. They have until this year's Grand Prix to exercise the break, but the break wouldn't happen until the end of 2019. So even if Silverstone says, we want to renegotiate our contract, they have a couple years to renegotiate it before it comes into effect. So the British Grand Prix is set until 2019 for sure, and then 2020, that's where the question mark comes in. Now, Silverstone has the advantage of being the only viable Grand Prix circuit in Britain, because the renovation of Donington Park fell apart because they couldn't finance it. However, Sayward was reporting on rumors that suggested a renewed interest in a London City race, something Bernie had been talking about. The target area would be just north of London City Airport in an area of former industrial land that is slated for redevelopment. The circuit and facilities would be integrated into the redevelopment, sort of in a manner similar to the race circuit and industrial and commercial park that was supposed to be the former Korea International Circuit in Yeongnam, Korea. More Sayward, this time about Max Verstappen. Sayward says that Red Bull has 3 performance criteria in its contract's performance clause, despite the fact Helmut Marko saying there's no performance clause. And the contract can be broken if 2 of the 3 aren't met. We can call it the Meatloaf performance clause, because 2 out of 3 ain't bad. So, the performance clauses are that they have to have a winning car, they finish top 3 in the World Constructors' Championship, and the driver finishes in the top 5 of the World Drivers' Championship. So if Red Bull doesn't win a race this season, whoever's the lower finishing Red Bull driver could break their contract if Joe's information is right. So we just looked at the World Drivers' standings. Right now, Ricciardo is 7 points up on Verstappen. So, right now, Verstappen is only fulfilling one of the 3 performance criteria. So, if Joe's right, Max could break his contract at the end of the season. And that probably has Ferrari very interested. Not all of our news is about the 2018 season, though. We might have a driver change happening shortly. F1 Today is reporting that Renault may dismiss Jolyon Palmer due to poor performance. Who would replace him is unknown, as the team only really retained him because Magnussen jumped ship to Haas. Palmer did finish in 11th, which is his best finish of the season. His previous best was 13th in China and Bahrain. Still no points. His teammate Hülkenberg had, prior to his gearbox, giving up 3 straight point-scoring finishes and was on pace to score a 4th straight one here until, again, gearbox. Hülkenberg has also scored the only points for Renault this season as well. So we know that Renault actually has a competitive car, relatively speaking, but Palmer hasn't been able to get as much out of it as his teammate. So who would replace Palmer if this story from F1 Today is true? Well, they suggested Pastor Maldonado because Renault were talking to him about the drive for this season before they were rebuffed by the Venezuelan. Maldonado suggested it wasn't going to be a competitive car. Well, what does he know? Felipe Nasr's manager says that he is in talks with a team about his driver's return to F1, which people are taking to be a return with Renault. There was a short-lived rumor that Fernando Alonso would return from his Indy 500 excursion with Renault rather than going back to McLaren, and all this ignores the possibility that they could ask for Sergei Sirotkin to jump from F2 to F1, or that Carmen Jordan might still be employed with the team. I have no idea if she is. So after all that talk about drivers and calendars, let's talk about 2018 tires to wrap up. Next season doesn't start for another 10 months, but people are already talking about next season, despite this World Drivers' Championship that we've got waging after 6 rounds. It's even though it's a one-race lead for Vettel, it's certainly far from being done, especially as we're getting into the power track portion of the season, and that Mercedes is going to come to life. Anyway, during the Spanish Grand Prix weekend, Pirelli had a meeting with the drivers to discuss the 2017 tires, and the consensus is that they are too conservative with the tires. Obviously, you could tell from the fact that the Ultra Softs could have gone the entire race length, according to Pirelli. Sergio Perez, in fact, claimed that the Pirelli hard tire is only good for taking photos if you want a driver's perspective on them. So, Pirelli F1 manager Mario Isola has said that he would like to make next year's medium and hard tires a little softer to close the performance gap to the soft tires. However, the actual construction and compounds for next year's tires won't be finalized until Pirelli has feedback from tracks with higher tire loading, like your Spas, like your Suzukas, like your Malaysias. But the goal is to make the hard tire actually usable, to close the gap down a bit from the medium to the soft tire. And you know what? I don't like the idea of closing the medium up too much, because you look at like Ferrari, for example, that's getting better use of their tires than Mercedes. Well, if you soften the medium tires, I mean, Ferrari has a bigger performance advantage on the mediums than they do on the softs, because they can make better use of those tires and they can activate them better than the Mercedes, for example. You know, why not reward someone that can use the tires as opposed to, well, let's make them a little easier to turn on and a little more grippy. With the hards, absolutely, because if nobody's using them, well, you got to do something to fix it. But you also have to be fair. It's like, if you can't turn on those tires, is that really Pirelli's problem in terms of the mediums anyway? But that will do it for this episode of the Formula One Drive-Thru Podcast. Next episode will come to you, unless Fernando Alonso wins the 500. By the time you watch this, I assume the race will already be over. But the next episode will come to you after the Canadian Grand Prix. Oh, Canada, our home and native land. Of course, you can see my Grand Prix 2 Let's Play of the 1994 Canadian Grand Prix just before the Canadian Grand Prix actual. And the next couple of weeks on the channel, if you're still tuned in, do hit that sub button, because we're going to have more Final Fantasy IX. And I'll tell you now, if you've made it all the way to the end this week, start Psychonauts on the channel, an all-time classic game. What a Let's Play to do. I love that game so far. But that's all the time we have for in this episode of the Grand Prix Drive-Thru, so thanks very much for joining me. Like the video if you liked it, subscribe if you're new, share on social media, follow on social media. The social media handle is Unsilent On Air, and that's for Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and Tumblr. And until the next time, I'm Unsilent. Thanks very much for joining me. Like, share, subscribe, and we will see you next time.